we were talking in the car on the way up here, and Giles is obviously, you've been married for how many years?
20.
20 years of marriage.
Congrats.
About.
Thank you.
You obviously met when you were 6.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's very kind of you to lie about the state of my face. But yes. So and actually probably married quite young in some respects. My wife has only just turned 20, so that's quite young, it seems, these days, to be married at that age.
Yeah. Oh, I think so, definitely. I've just got married. Well, I was 50 when we got married last year, so...
Well, congratulations to you.
Thank you.
Wow.
I mean, I guess it's a bit different for me. As a gay woman, I wasn't allowed to when I was younger. And I never thought that I would, because I assumed that was going to be the way things were. It was something I was campaigning about as a student in the 1990s. We staged a fake wedding outside York Minster on Valentine's Day in 1992. And, we were just thinking this was pure science fiction, that 2 women and 2 men would get married, and we were sort of shouting through megaphones, "Love is not a crime."
Yeah.
Wow.
And so it's quite surreal in a way that things have come such a long way, but also there's still such a long way to go. And I think we forget that even though things are much easier for LGBTQ plus people, sometimes the way we speak and think about relationships is not always inclusive and conscious of different types of relationship narratives, which is why, for me, writing and speaking about relationships from the perspective of a gay woman, a midlife gay woman, is really important, and having that authenticity and having that voice represented amidst the sort of heteronormative texts that have, a lot of really fascinating information about how we fall in love and out of love. But I really wanted to focus on a more inclusive way of thinking about relationships, and also a conscious and compassionate way in this weird era that we're in. Of, we talk about the podcasting boom, but we've had this huge boom in dating app technology and how we can meet one another and how we can then treat people as maybe something a bit disposable, and we ghost people. And there's this whole new language about how to disappear and let people down without even having a conversation. My favourite one being Marleying, where you ghost someone and pop up again at Christmas.
Ooh, I haven't heard of that one before. That's good.
Well, I was going to say, it feels like a golden age might not be the right terminology, but there does seem to be an awful lot of language now around relationships and stuff, and like things like ghosting and gaslighting, all these things I obviously feel quite new, but I guess maybe they're not that new. I mean, obviously the actual act of those things is not new, but the actual wording perhaps is.
Yes, I think technology has made a lot of these behaviours easier. It's facilitated these behaviours. But of course, historically, they've always gone on. We've always just disappeared and not wanted to have that conversation, that awkward conversation with someone when we don't fancy them anymore, or we don't want to have a relationship with them. But I suppose in my teens, in the 1980s, people just sort of didn't turn up to a date and you got stood up in the pub. That happened to me once, which was absolutely mortifying. So, maybe that's worse. You might have a preference as to what you would prefer, but if someone stops replying to you, you just wonder, where have they gone? And indeed, one of the chapters of my book, The Break-Up Monologues, also the same title as my podcast, is I thought I'd been ghosted, but he'd just gone to prison.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I actually read that. I've read your book, and that was quite a catchy title to the chapter. I was immediately like, hello. Well, I'm interested. You've piqued my interest. But I guess with not just social media, but just phones and technology in general, it's easier to keep in touch anyway. And so it's more noticeable when somebody does drop off the radar, because, almost everyone nowadays has a phone or social media or like some way of keeping in touch. I mean, like when my parents, for example, were dating, they had to write each other letters. And so or they would like walk down to the local phone box, and it would be like a whole big thing. And so it was a real effort to sort of keep in touch and remain friends or be in a relationship or whatever that might be. Whereas now it's so easy to keep in touch. And so I guess it's more noticeable if someone does try to drop off the radar, and it's easier to kind of keep like pecking away, like, sending messages, and what do they say, like double texting or being left on red and stuff like that. Like the lexicon is just absolutely vast nowadays.
I know. And I love the idea of still writing letters if we can ever find the time. Although postage is really expensive now, isn't it? I don't even know what it costs to post a letter. Maybe I should hand deliver it, which then defeats the object of having written it. You could recite it out.
Yeah, I was going to say you could read it to them.
Yeah. But yeah, I know one of my relationships when I was... it was when I sort of first went away to Edinburgh in my mid-30s, and I'd only just met somebody and fallen in love, and so we wrote to each other quite a bit. I mean, she did come and visit me for a brief time during the Fringe, but we wrote each other letters, and it was so nice because even then that was like the mid-noughties, and it still felt a bit old-fashioned to write letters, but it was such a thrill. It was such an exciting thing to see an envelope with her handwriting on, especially when you're away doing the mayhem of the Fringe.
Yeah, I can imagine.
You need a bit of moral support and a bit of a cheerleader saying, hang in there, hope it's going all right.
Yeah, I had an ex-boyfriend who was in the military, and he, particularly during basic training and stuff like that, they weren't allowed phones. So some of them would kind of sneak their phones in the night and stuff, but for the most part, we couldn't keep in touch via phone. And so he used to send me letters, and it would always come in this like military envelope, and it was really exciting because I obviously knew who it was from.
Ministry of Defence or something.
Exactly. I won't say what kind of military.
I wonder if anyone had read it to check.
Probably, yeah. Well, that's interesting actually. That's a whole thing, because then your privacy. I mean, there wasn't anything particularly sordid in it. That I remember.
Shame.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think I've still got them. I think I put them in my memory box because of like the fact that they were these really cool letters. It's like, when am I ever going to do that again? Realistically.
Yeah, well, my wife and I wrote each other's letters when we first started going out. Again, it was early noughties, and I probably did feel a bit
For a minute
old-fashioned.
there, I thought you said you wrote each other's letters, and I thought, did you sort of pretend to be her and write a letter?
That would be very odd. No, we wrote each other letters.
I'm sure this is what you'd say.
It's a new kind of role play.
Yeah.
Let's pretend to be each other.
But it was really special. I think that's we've kept all the letters as well, and actually occasional nostalgia trips, go and have a look through and see how young and strange we were in those days. But it is something lovely about that, the physical act of writing, and then obviously being able to read it, and obviously there's a lot of effort goes into it. So there is something special about letter writing, maybe something that should come back a little bit more.
Yeah.
What's your favourite terminology? I know you just mentioned Marleying. Have you got a favourite terminology?
I don't know. I think there's so many phrases, but I tend to prefer certainly the concepts that are about sort of kinder, more compassionate behaviour, as opposed to, I think all of these phrases like ghosting and breadcrumbing and icing and benching, there are so many. They're all really about just, disappearing without speaking to somebody, right, because you don't want to actually have that conversation, and you're not able to own it and own the fact that you perhaps have promised in some way or hinted at the potential of a relationship, and then you aren't able to follow through with that. I mean, I feel in the sort of LGBTQ plus community over the years, we've had a slightly different take on that. And I think in some ways we're now, as we have access to marriage and more equal rights, the sort of downside of that is that we're absorbing some of the heteronormative culture, which is not always as kind. I think when we were really, really discriminated against, when we were right in the thick of horrible homophobic policies, which meant that teachers couldn't talk about being gay in schools, and we were invisible, and that the AIDS and HIV crisis meant that homophobia was at an all-time high when I was a teenager. And so I think people who were gay really, really stuck together and were really kind to one another. And you know what? If you had slept with someone, or you had a date with someone, or a little fling with somebody and it didn't work out, you would probably make a real commitment to be friends and look out for one another, even if you weren't going to get married. And you couldn't get married, but even if you weren't going to sort of live together and be a couple, you were still bonded or allied in some way. You were still, fighting this fight for visibility and some kind of voice in the world. So I suppose I come from this slightly old school queerness, and now there are all these brilliant young queer people, and labels are altering a little, which I think is really interesting, and I've decided to sort of go with this to some extent, because I've always thought of myself as a lesbian, because my primary important, significant, emotionally deep, loving relationships have been with women. However, in the book, there's a chapter where I go to a sex lab and participate in this bizarre experiment where my genital arousal is being measured, and things like my pupil dilation are being measured whilst I'm looking at erotic images of men and women. And the idea, I suppose, is that for many people, in particular among women, our sort of animal sexuality may be a bit broader than the sort of narrowly constructed social, cultural and political identities that we've attached to ourselves via these labels, which have served a really important purpose when we were campaigning for things like same-sex marriage and for equality. But I appreciate that our human sexuality is so much more complex than these sort of binaries, and now we're coming to terms with the fact that people aren't necessarily male or female, and also people aren't necessarily gay or straight. And so I have started talking about the fact that I'm probably on a more sort of complex spectrum, where perhaps I am a bit bisexual or pansexual, because sometimes I've been attracted to people who aren't women. I've been attracted to men and non-binary people, and so it is complex. But I do think that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that there's also our sort of social, cultural and political identity, which is how other people treat us and place us and position us in the world. And that's where our power and our privilege comes from. And so as a gay woman, there are a number of things that I have not been able to do, like have children, really significant things, which you really, when you reach my age and you're perimenopausal and you're probably not biologically able to have children anymore, you really think about how these things have altered the course of your life, and that can be really, really sad and really poignant. And it might have been nice to at least have had that as a possibility, but it really was only a possibility for sort of the more affluent lesbians, the real pioneering lesbians, the ones who could afford IVF, which is not cheap. So I think we need to, whilst we have more fluid labels, and that's really great, I sometimes find it challenging when there are, and I sort of do some jokes about how, straight women come up to me and go, oh, I wish I was a lesbian. And I've got a bit in my set now where I say to this woman who says that to me, rather than sort of list all the structural inequalities that might have meant it might not be easier to be a lesbian, I say, oh, well, but have you tried scissoring? Because as a comedian, you've got to make everything a bit fun. But I do struggle with this new sort of notion of aspirational queerness, like, oh, I'm going to say that I'm queer because that makes me a bit sort of edgy and interesting, without those people necessarily always having an understanding of the legacy of trauma that people who've lived queer lives for the past few decades have really gone through, and what they're still dealing with, and how that has impacted and played out in their lives. And so, recently I've found myself feeling upset with someone that I really love and respect, who is a friend of mine on social media and in the real world too, who is a heteronormative bi woman who's very much at the heteronormative end of the sort of bisexual spectrum and normally dates men. And she has been posting some of her comedy clips, which are great. She's a brilliant comedian. But there are clips that I believe erase lesbian women. And so it's really hard. And I kind of think if we can't communicate with the people who we actually love and trust and respect and who are part of our community about, I'm not sure I feel okay about that joke that you do, then how can we even go further than that and sort of address the people that really are stirring up the hatred and causing the problems for our community and the people that we love? So in some ways, I've been trying to think about how to communicate with the people within my LGBTQ plus world about how we all need to think about our privilege, about the intersections of our privilege, and how, you know, maybe I'm not always conscious of being, you know, a white gay woman or an able-bodied, you know, gay woman, and some of the complexities about how we've arrived at where we're at and what we've been through and what people other than us might have been through and their experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, yeah, once you've been, I mean, I hate to sort of generalise, but I guess once you have been through one sort of struggle, you become a little bit more, your eyes are kind of open to all the different sorts of struggles in different areas as well, whereas somebody that hasn't been through any of that discrimination is completely privileged and probably doesn't understand as well. Like, as I don't know, for example, I don't want to pick on you, Giles, but you know,
that's right. I'm here for the big
that's why
picture.
he said. But like, as a straight white man, I guess, yeah, maybe you might not. Like, we've had conversations so many times where I've sort of talked about how angry I personally get about sort of like gender inequality and how women in sort of like my industry aren't represented or paid enough and blah blah blah. And then so there's areas that you might not see, and then there's areas that I don't see as a straight white woman as well. So it's you know, it's hard because obviously that's come off of the back of all the discrimination and all the hatred and just like all this horrible stuff. But it's good that you've kind of, within that, you're more kind of empathetic and you've created like a more of a compassionate, kind, loving community. And I know that you said before that you tend to sort of stay friends with people after breaking up because, you know, you've got that in common kind of thing, and you understand what it's like to have all of that hatred stirred up.
Yeah, that's certainly been the history and the tradition, if you like, of lesbian breakups. I mean, I believe that we pioneered conscious uncoupling long before Gwyneth Paltrow. And I think that's what I was really trying to come to when we started talking about terminology, was even though I don't particularly like the sound of conscious uncoupling, it sounds a little bit grand and pretentious, doesn't it? But I really like the theory of it, the idea of remaining close, maintaining some kind of family-like ties, because I think in general, as soon as I got to London, at least in the about 1993 when I graduated, I felt like LGBTQ plus people, even though we only really said lesbian and gay then, there were loads of trans people, there were loads of queer people, there were loads of people who were more fluid, who were bi, who were pan, but we didn't quite have all the language to understand it yet, and we didn't have the same conversations now we do about pronouns. But I was friends with loads of trans women, and they were like, you know, I'm a woman and my pronouns are she and her, and I'd be like, yeah, of course, you know, there wasn't really any issue. So yeah, I think there was this feeling of it being a family. And Armistead Maupin, one of my favourite writers, actually talks about logical family as opposed to biological family, and this idea that you can, you know, choose your family and construct and create a different type of family, maybe if you don't have a big biological family, or indeed if they reject you or you don't get on, which was the case for many gay people in decades gone by. So I do really like this idea of sort of chosen family and constructing a different type of family. It might be sort of fluid throughout your lifetime. Different friendships do come and go, and that can be really sad. I mean, I talk about friendship breakups and how Giles, you look like you've had one of those.
Yeah, I certainly have, and they're tough.
He's been trying to break up with me for ages.
It's not doing very well.
No.
I just cling on. Like, we're going to start a podcast to solidify our friendship.
Yeah. It's funny though, I was thinking on that, like with regards to kind of the books about breakup or conversations about breakup are often very kind of heterosexual centric. There's not necessarily the same emphasis put on same-sex relationships or any, you know, all these different other aspects of relationships we've sort of touched on a little bit. Is that something that needs to be addressed a little bit more as well, because it's not a one size fits all with regards to breakup?
It's definitely not a one size fits all with regard to relationships ending or beginning or in the middle of
Yeah.
maintaining relationships. And yeah, that's certainly something I addressed in my first book, is Monogamy Dead, which was looking at how we have relationships, what monogamy means, how we even talk about monogamy, and how we're really bad at talking about monogamy because we just assume it means that we don't have sex with other people. But actually, lots of people have different boundaries about emotional closeness or about kissing or different physical things that you could do. And I really learnt the most I've ever learnt about boundaries when I went and did comedy at a sex party, which was a very interesting evening. And there's a little cabaret before the sort of sex room, if you like, it's cordoned off. That's opened up later on after the cabaret, but this is just a bit of fun to warm everyone up. And a few comedians and cabaret performers were doing about 5 minutes each. You don't want to go on too long when people are impatient to get to the
They're desperate to get to the sex room. Enough with the jokes, right?
But what was really fascinating to me was entering that space. You had to sign up to a list of rules about respecting boundaries, about consent, about communication, about being accountable, about looking out for other people's behaviour. And you had to go in with a pal who would basically take you home if you were being a bit drunk or being weird or anything. So these were just these really useful takeaway rules for all our types of relationships and all our situations, our professional relationships, our working relationships. We don't often think about boundaries and how our different attachment styles, how our different histories inform how we go about communicating with people and negotiating what we want or what we need or what we hope for or dream for, at least. And yeah, it's been an eye-opener to me to think about different types of relationships and more polyamorous types of relationships, rather than sort of traditional monogamous background that I came from. And, I still had, I suppose, was imbued with a lot of kind of traditional values of just being with one partner, even though I thought outside the box to some extent by being with a woman. But yeah, it's been so fascinating to go on that journey and think about relationships and love in a very different way, and think about how we as humans connect and disconnect, and how we can do that more compassionately.
Yeah, there's a lot to be learnt from each other and from different types of relationships as well, I think. And obviously we were talking about these different terminology for like your ghosting and your stuff like that, but what it all sort of comes down to it is a lack of, or a breakdown of communication, I think. You don't want to have the conversation and explain that you're not into somebody because it's uncomfortable, and you get that in relationships as well. You don't want to voice your needs, or you don't want to put up that boundary, and that might be because that's how you've been brought up, and you haven't been made to feel safe to sort of communicate your needs. But ultimately what it comes down to is a communication or a lack of communication. And the good relationships, whether they are very traditional with two people that are in love, get married and that's that, or two people that like to experiment or do certain things, like whatever type of relationship it is, I think the key to a successful relationship seems to be communication, being able to communicate your boundaries, what you need, what you expect of that person, what you can offer the other person, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I was actually giving a talk in Brixton last week, just before Valentine's Day. And there was a young woman who asked me, well, how can you talk about polyamory to people who are very strictly monogamous? And she felt frustrated that her friends would judge her if she wanted to open up her relationship, because she saw the two things as very diametrically opposed. And I said, they're really not that different if you think about, there are people doing monogamy really well, as you've just described, being really conscious and compassionate and talking in a healthy way about boundaries and their attachment styles and what they bring to the table in terms of hang-ups and fears and neuroses. And there are people doing polyamory really well and having all those conversations too. It's just the difference that I've noticed is that in general, people doing polyamory are sort of forced to have those conversations, whereas within the sort of more traditional monogamous structures, we haven't necessarily realised that we had to, but we do need to. It's an exercise that we all need to do. It's a muscle that needs to be trained to think about how to communicate. But also, what's been interesting is how you say, Giles, that a lot of these conversations are very heteronormative, and a lot of these books and podcasts and texts are quite heteronormative, because I've noticed how many people use the word divorce as opposed to breakup. And I don't get me wrong, I love some of the people who are doing some brilliant podcasts about divorce, and I've guested on a lot of them, and they're fantastic. But when those podcasts started popping up, I felt really excluded by them, because I have had, well, I say in my introduction to the book, I've had kind of 5 marriages, really.
Yeah.
If I'd been allowed to, I think I'd have probably had 4 divorces. You know, well, I don't know. Maybe if you can get married and get divorced, I don't know. Do you have a different conversation, and do you make it work for longer? Do you? Yeah, I don't know. But I certainly at certain stages and certain points in each of those relationships would have married that person and wanted to, and you know, actually in one case was proposed to, but we couldn't even do anything at that point. So it's been really interesting to me to see how challenging it is when you want to have a more inclusive conversation, how not having the word divorce in your book title actually impacts what charts and what categories you get put into on Amazon, and what your rankings are, and what your visibility is, because a lot of women who've been through a divorce are looking for a book specifically about divorce, whereas those women that have somehow circuitously come to me have gone, oh my God, it was so refreshing to read a book by a gay woman about having relationships with women, and it's just like this really different take on it, and you went into the science of it and all these other areas I hadn't really read about when I've been sort of just talking about divorce and how annoying men are.
Yeah, they can be.
Yeah, but you know, so it's been an eye-opener to me how trying to have a more inclusive conversation can actually make it difficult to get out there in some senses, in terms of your own visibility.
Definitely. I mean, obviously I've said I'm a straight woman, but I found your book really helpful because I've never been married, and often with these books about divorce and stuff, it's a very specific demographic of people that have been married. And I think nowadays people are, and I can't back this up with any facts because I'm just lazy and I can't be bothered to find out, but I would imagine that nowadays people are getting married a lot later in life. And I'm saying this as a woman in her 30s as well, so, with no kids. So I hope that people are getting married later in life. And so, previously people would be, people of our parents' generation would have been getting married when they were in their sort of late teens, early 20s kind of thing. And now people are getting married a lot later. So you're having a huge stretch of your adult life where you're just going through breakups, which, aside from obviously with marriage and divorce comes the money side of things and the legalities and stuff like that. But emotionally, I feel like divorces and breakups can be very similar and they can be very different. I mean, I think some people break up, go through a breakup and they're hugely heartbroken, and some people go through a divorce and they're kind of like, oh God, I'm so glad that that's over. It's kind of like it was ready to end kind of thing.
Well, so, it can be this moment of real triumph, can't it? If you think about, there's a famous picture of Nicole Kidman when she's got the divorce through from Tom Cruise.
Yes, thank God.
She's punching the air.
Exactly,
And obviously the subtitle of my book is The Unexpected Joy of Heartbreak, because it is about that journey of freedom, transformation, reinvention, new adventures, new journeys. I wrote the first half of the book in a sort of backwards timeline and the second half in a forwards timeline to really illustrate that idea that, like the sort of child's butterfly painting, we do sometimes go through these symmetries in our lives, and the ending of something is always the beginning of a new chapter, which is informed by some of the colour and vibrancy that we remember from that previous relationship, but actually we're moving forwards in a new direction.
Oh God, yeah. When I think about, and this is one of my favourite things to do, not just with breakups and relationships, but just with life things in general. I'm kind of big believer of like, oh, everything happens for a reason and stuff. But when I look back on all my relationships, I genuinely wouldn't be where I am right now, even in this room, if any of those relationships had been any different. And if I hadn't have met this person, I probably wouldn't have moved to that town, and then I wouldn't have met the next person, and then that, that informed my career in some way. And if I hadn't have had my heart broken, then I wouldn't have thrown myself into work. And so it's so interesting how that kind of, it's like the butterfly effect, isn't it? Ironically. exactly.
Yeah, all our experiences are part of shaping our identity and who we are. All those experiences, good and bad. Pain is sometimes useful, a useful learning experience.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Giles, you've maybe had like one breakup in your life, so you're sitting here with a very glazed look on your face as someone that's been.
I've just had it's all been rosy for me, to be honest. Yeah, it's all been great. But we all do experience, even if it's being rejected by Kirsty in year 9 at school. Whatever it might be, you have moments of those things. I have had big breakups as well. But yeah, we all experience that, and like you say, it's not always necessarily a romantic thing. It could be a friendship or a work opportunity you've missed out on. Whatever it might be, there's breakups in other forms. Yes,
and I mean the way you speak on social media about sort of compassion and kindness, which is really your thing, isn't it? I feel like Giles must have been through some stuff, to have that openness and that desire to communicate that message of encouraging people to think of one another and look out for one another. So I think you must have had some different...
I have. But yeah, it does, it forms you, and we grow from these experiences, don't we? And going back to what we were saying about the kind of self-help books and stuff around divorce, and it's interesting you say that because of the key words maybe not necessarily in there, that it can be detrimental sometimes. I guess a lot of those books probably deal with the kind of grief loss aspect of the breakup, as opposed to what we're talking about now, which is that moving on for that thing and how actually those relationships do form us in some way.
Yes, I mean, well, I think those two things sort of go hand in hand, because you unfortunately have to go through the grief and the loss to get to the reinvention and transformation and the new you and the positive you that's going to move forward in this energized way and be creative and, I don't know, write books and do things, sort of be fueled by by the energy of the breakup in a sense. So I think those two things go hand in hand, and we certainly do go through a process of grieving. We have to, really, for any loss, whether it's a human relationship or, I mean, we lost one of our pets, our cat, a year or so ago, and we'd taken on another kitten, and he turned out to be very, very ill, and he only lived to just over a year, and that, I think that was one of the hardest things that I've ever been through.
Yeah Oh, I cannot cope with pet losses.
It was awful.
That's
Oh, I'm sorry.
they literally
are
part of the family, and often people kind of like, I see my dog as my child, and I've said to all my friends, like, I've pre-warned that when she does die, which hopefully won't be for many years, but
never will. No.
You'll receive a text from me explaining, and then you won't hear from me for a few months. I'll be in deep mourning.
It's just the worst. It's awful. Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that.
Oh, well, I mean, I can comfort myself in that we gave him the most amazing life. I mean, really, from a few months old, he was very severely disabled, but he clearly was stimulated by and enjoyed being out and about in the world, particularly with our dog. He absolutely adored our dog. So we used to take him around with us in a little papoose, and he went to the beach, and we got photos of him on the beach having an amazing time. He went to a festival, Prima Donna Festival, which is this wonderful festival celebrating women's writing, and my wife was holding him in the audience at my comedy show, and one of the other comedians was like, hang on, there's a cat in the audience. And she like held up Ziggy, our cat, and it was like that moment from The Lion King where everyone was like, oh my god. And he was like the star of the show, but he seemed like he purred all the time. He was this cuddly boy. He loved people holding him and cuddling him, and he seemed to love that sort of attention and lots of different people and smells and sights and sounds, until, you know, eventually he couldn't sort of see properly or respond properly. So
little thing.
But, you know, we gave him a great time.
Well, that's the main thing. That's the main thing.
So moving on from breakups, obviously forming new relationships with people, and we sort of touched on it earlier, but it's something that's fascinating me, is that kind of where we are now with online dating kind of versus, I guess, the more organic traditional, if I hate to use that word, but kind of meeting people. Do you feel like some of that has become a slightly gamification around that process?
Yes, that's definitely a word that many dating experts use. My friend Nikki Hodgson, who's written a book about the curious history of dating, she used that word when she guested on my podcast. So, yeah, it has been gamified, and people do seem like just players in a game rather than human beings that we need to think about, who have feelings, who are, we're not disposable. In my first book, I talk about sort of throwing people away like empty crisp packets. When we've eaten the crisps, we're just like, yeah, whatever.
Do you remember that game, The Sims?
Yes.
And you used to
when you create your own family.
Yeah,
you'd create
really get into
people. That. I was addicted to it, and people used to like kill people off for fun and stuff, or a bit like Grand Theft Auto. You just like walking around with a gun, like shooting people, and it was really fun because you're like, oh, I'm going to build a swimming pool, and then they're going to get in the swimming pool, and then I'm going to take the stairs away, and they're just going to be swimming around trying to get out of the pool until they die.
Wow!
Oh my god!
We're learning a lot about you, Sophie.
Or like put them in a room and then take the door out. These were all like common things. People used to do it for fun, but it was. In general, like the idea behind the game is like you're playing God, and you're like playing with these characters and these people, and you have the control, and it kind of, for me, these dating apps and stuff kind of reminds me a little bit of that, like these characters in a game, and you're just kind of swiping away.
I did not know that about you, but it's good to know. It's good to learn these things.
Yeah, it is.
I'm going to leave now.
I suppose our expectations are often, when we date somebody, perhaps when we're, in our home city and they live nearby, our expectations, unless it's explicitly stated, are that this might be a long-term relationship. This might be my new soulmate for forever. Well, I don't know if I believe in forever. I mean, there's this idea, isn't there, that there's this another kind of strange term is the relationship escalator, where you're basically societally being kind of rushed through all these relationship stages, from dating to living together to getting married to having kids, and then eventually you die. Yay, you've reached the sort of summit of relationship goals.
Yeah, it's like that. Is it, would we call it a nursery rhyme? Not a nursery rhyme, but when you're a kid, you're like, oh, you love so and so. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby and a golden carriage. You're like going through the stages.
Yeah.
And it is. It's like a societal expectation. And when you go to like events, like weddings and stuff, everyone's like, oh, what next?
You next. Well, I mean, you get thrown the bouquet, don't you? So like, let's pick the next person. Who's the next victim? And obviously you get the Hollywood thing where they're all vying for the bouquet, and they're shoving each other out the way. They're desperate to get married. But yeah, it's true though, isn't it?
Yeah. And we sort of celebrate wedding anniversaries, with this ascending hierarchy of gifts, from sort of wood or paper or whatever to gold, and
platinum,
rubies and diamonds. And it does seem crazy that there's this higher value within that sort of traditional monoculture attached to a longer term relationship, even if the people involved are not happy anymore. And probably nobody around them is that happy if they're unfulfilled. So I do think it's been interesting, and that's been another eye-opening part of talking to people who are polyamorous and having more than one significant romantic or sexual relationship, and how a relationship's duration might not be this measure of its value. You might have this incredibly valuable connection that is fairly short-lived. It might be life-changing. I've definitely had those.
Yeah. Same. Sorry.
All right. Yeah, no. Well, I was going to say that's something you've touched upon a bit there, Soph, earlier, by saying there's that you wouldn't be necessarily where you are without having no significant partners, or even the effect of the breakup.
Yeah, everyone teaches you. I mean, there's that kind of idea that everyone in life, not just relationships, but everybody around you is always constantly holding up mirrors to you, showing you, reflecting back to you the stuff that you don't like about yourself, or the stuff that you're insecure about, and often I think in relationships what we tend to do is we see something reflected back at us that we don't like, something that triggers an insecurity, and instead of thinking, oh, this is something that I need to work on, we reflect it back on them, and we kind of are like, oh, you're not doing this or you're not doing that, like you're not making me happy, which is your job, kind of thing. And then that's when there becomes a bit of resentment build up and contempt, and the, you know, what was it, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse start to arrive. And so yeah, I guess there's always that responsibility on both, or all parties I should say, to constantly be looking at yourself rather than like expecting other people to make you happy in a relationship, because that's not, you know, it's not our jobs.
Well, that actually is very polyamorous thing, I think, from what, you know, from a few documentaries I've seen about it, is the idea about it's, you know, it's not up to the partner to make you happy, it's up to you to make yourself happy.
Yeah, that's right. Although it's tricky, isn't it? Because partners can definitely make us unhappy.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Sometimes.
But again, I think that also, though, looking at it, playing devil's advocate, because I've been in relationships where partners have done some like really nasty things, but actually I look back in hindsight now as well, the onus was on me to recognise I wasn't being treated well and have enough self-worth to walk away, but I didn't have the self-worth to recognise that I deserve better, kind of thing. And so you kind of put up within, you think they're going to change, and you know, the whole thing. So yeah, it's, I know what you mean, but I guess in some ways that even that you can lead back to yourself.
Oh, no, you can indeed. And I think, you know, in relationships that you want to stay in, where someone is doing something that is not making you feel good, then you have to talk about that, and you have to talk about how they can just use slightly different language, or just think about asking about something in a different way, or, you know, just maybe going, if there's something that makes them angry, to maybe go and express that somewhere else, you know, because it's difficult if someone kind of gets pissed off with things that, you know, they liked about you at first. That can be a challenge, can't it? If you
that's a good point.
Yeah, so it's like you feel like, well, should I be changing? Do I need to take responsibility for something that is, you know, my partner doesn't like, or is it actually somehow they're responding to me in a different way? And is that something about their changing feelings? And feelings change through the course of a relationship quite naturally. The different chemicals that are whizzing through the brain are very different right at the beginning of a connection, when we are very focused. If we're, you know, if we are sexual beings, some people are asexual and they might have a slightly different way of going about the start of a relationship. But for many of us, we, you know, do have that phase of having a lot of sex, which is a lot of fun, but then that changes, and it can feel quite rejecting, and it can feel hard when that does change. And particularly maybe for the partner who has a higher sex drive, they may feel rejected. So there are a lot of things, even if we're in a relatively healthy and good and compassionate and, you know, secure relationship, there are still things that need to be negotiated and discussed and talked about, because no two people are ever going to kind of grow in exactly the same way and in exactly the same direction. And, you know, I think sometimes if you stay together, it's not always a great sign if you stay together forever, because you haven't both perhaps grown in the way that you wanted to. Sometimes growing apart is still growth. It's still healthy growth.
Yeah, definitely. And you speak a bit about the different types of, or the different reasons behind why people break up. And so I think like sexual incompatibility is definitely one of them. And I forget what the others were now. You might be able to inform me, but it's sexual. I don't ask why. That was the one that I remember.
You just remembered that one, yeah.
Well, yeah, because
sex was like,
because that's number one, really. That is the key in a very sexualized society. When we feel the pressure to have sex all the time, we do often assume that if the sex stops in a relationship, that means we should break up, which often isn't necessarily the case at all. But we do have to have a discussion about how we still want to have some intimacy, or whether, you know, some people might open up a primary partnership. I know certainly some people who've done that very successfully, and they might express themselves sexually with other partners, and then perhaps that might even energize the primary partnership again. Or, you know, some people might move away from needing a certain type of sex, a certain script about how we're supposed to have sex and what the end goal of that is. They might look for other forms of intimacy as they get older. I mean, women, I talk a bit in my book about women going through perimenopause and menopause, and your hormones are all over the place at that time in your life, and sometimes you feel really sexy, and then for a long period you might feel so unattractive and unsexy, because your body's just going through so many changes. So it's that sex is definitely a big factor in how we think about our relationships and whether they're going well or not. I know people who are in quite bad relationships, but because they have mind-blowing sex every time they have a terrible argument, they kind of think, oh, well, everything's fine again.
Yeah, it's passionate.
It's passionate. It's passion, yes.
It's just passion. Yeah. I guess the sexual incompatibility, financial incompatibility or lifestyle incompatibility, whatever the incompatibilities are that lead the breakup, again, it comes back to communication, I guess. So, communicating what your needs are, communicating what's changed.
Yeah, I think some of the other reasons were sort of drug and alcohol, mental health issues. But yeah, money is an incompatibility, not necessarily in terms of whether you have money or you don't have money, but whether your belief systems about money are compatible or not. But also your sort of political values. And it's interesting how divorce rates rose after, a very binary referendum like Brexit, but also during the pandemic. Of course, there was the factor of people being cooped up together and realising they didn't like each other very much. But then there was also the sort of vaccine or no vaccine, that was a discussion that polarized many people as well.
I suppose it was a very cultural specific thing to suddenly realize you're not compatible, having whether or not you're going to get a vaccination for some obscure virus that we didn't even know existed like a few years previously. And suddenly you find yourself breaking up over it or getting into big arguments about it. That is interesting. It's interesting that you talk about the sort of financial mindset over, because I think when most people think about financial inequality or financial incompatibility, they presume it's more, this person earns more and so they are accustomed to a different type of lifestyle or whatever. But actually you can get two people that earn a lot or two people that don't earn very much money relatively, and their mindsets are so wildly different, and so it causes sort of issues in other areas. Someone might believe that all wealthy people are evil and that money is the root of all evil or whatever the phrase is, and then someone else might be just very into like charitable giving or whatever, just might not need much money to survive off of and stuff like that. It's quite interesting actually.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And where you do have an inequality in earnings, I suppose it's about how the person earning more sort of recognises the position of power they are potentially in, and how to help the other person to feel empowered. And it's certainly that's been one of the trickiest topics in my relationship with my wife, because she has a much more stable income than I do as a writer and comedian and speaker and thinker and all of this kind of stuff. So it sometimes can feel hard because I work really, really hard, often for very little. Authors often don't get paid very well for writing books, not so much because publishers are taking all the money, but because certain retailers are. But I still tell everyone they've got to buy my book there, because we're sort of trapped into this terrible thing. But
buy the book, the Break-Up Monologues. It's hard, and it's definitely been something we've had to really, really think about how we,
sort of do things fairly and happily, and sometimes I'll pay for dinner and take us out for brunch or whatever, but typically if it's somewhere really expensive, she might pay because she is earning more. But she wants us to be able to still treat ourselves and go out for those more expensive meals that I wouldn't be able to afford very regularly, to be honest. But it's complex.
It is. But Rosie, this has been fantastic. I mean, always learn a lot talking to you about all sorts of different aspects of relationships. It's obviously been a therapy session for
That's
Sophie.
what I was trying to say earlier. I was like, what's a nice way of putting this? That I'm excited to talk to you because
I need to talk to
on
you.
the car on the way up, I was like, I can't wait.
Need some help.
I just love stuff. No, it's just I just love stuff like this. Honestly, it's right up my street. I find relationships and just the concept of relationships so fascinating, and yeah,
it really is. And I think it's so transferable to our work relationships, our friendships, all our different types of relationships. Just thinking about how we treat one another, how we communicate, as I think that's come up as the key. So yeah, definitely. And I have even been known to do some spoof therapy in character as Dr. Love was my therapy character.
Could we do a quick?
It was kind of art installation thing where a friend of mine asked me to do some quick little performances where people would come and see, couples mostly would come and see me for spoof couples therapy, and I just sort of recited them some kind of spoof love poetry and that kind of thing. But they said
you've saved my marriage.
They said they felt much better than when they saw their real therapist.
Gives them a giggle at least.
Yeah, laughter is healing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, thank you, Rosie. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. And if people want to keep in touch, I would love to hear from them. I'm at Break-Up Monologues on Instagram and at Rosie Wilby on Twitter.